Hey, this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here with another edition of No Labels Talks. And once again, I have Holly Page with me. Holly, how are you?
I'm great, Ryan. How are you?
I am good. We are talking here on a very solemn day, 80 years since the D-Day invasion. We were actually talking before we got on about watching the ceremony over there in Normandy today and looking at the heroes up on the stage who are looking quite frail. And it reminds you they're not going to be here for the 90th. So it really is a passing of the greatest generation, which is the greatest for a reason.
Absolutely. I was very moved by the whole ceremony and taken with a point that Ken Burns made when he was doing the coverage, the commentary, that this was the largest amphibious invasion ever in the history of the world, and the largest certainly that was committed to liberation and not to conquering and taking territory. And I think that, thinking about D-Day from that entry point really made me appreciate the word greatest in the greatest generation, that these folks were willing to sacrifice their life, obviously for an American mission and for the United States of America, but literally on D-Day to storm those beaches to liberate other people. And yeah, it was very moving.
It is, when you read about it, the more you read about it, the more in awe you are of what it was. I mean, you had a million allied forces. One of the things I was reading about this week was the extent to which that entire mission turned on weather. They were just waiting for a decent enough weather day, because if they didn't get that, there was a lot of concern it would delay the invasion by a month, and then the Axis powers would become aware of it and it would ruin the whole mission. I mean, it's unbelievable to think that the whole war could have turned on. There was enough sun and calm seas on June 6th of 1944.
Absolutely. Well, it was actually scheduled for the day before, but there was a terrible storm in the Atlantic, and so Eisenhower postponed it. But, I think the other really interesting point that I heard this morning that's very appropriate for where we're at right now in our nation's history is somebody made the point that in France, leading up to the occupation of the Nazis, that they really did not have any distinguished leaders who were willing to put the interest of the nation above their partisan political agenda and interest. They played the short game and not the long game. And that in the United States and Britain, there were just enough people who were willing to sacrifice their own political futures, really, for the greater common good. Just enough people at just the right time to show up and do that, and that made all the difference. And I thought about that again in the context of today. We need more of that.
Well, we do, especially if you think about, the last two No Labels talks we've had before this one. The last two speakers, Dr. Corey Shockey, Seth Cropsey, both really accomplished national security experts, both of whom think this is the 1930s all over again, in terms of the threats that are developing on the horizon. And of course, what you hope is that we have enough wisdom and selflessness and patriotism in our leaders that they can get us through to a place where it doesn't end like the 1930s did, which was the outbreak of war in 1941.
Absolutely. And I think the No Labels community really is a galvanizing force to support, encourage, reward, incentivize those leaders who are willing to do that, and why the work that we do every day is so meaningful, really.
Well, look, whatever you do, because I saw the same thing. If you didn't get a chance to see it, I would really encourage people to take a look at that ceremony today. President Biden is there speaking in Normandy. I would actually also encourage people, if they haven't seen it, to look at Ronald Reagan's speech that he gave in 1984, which was really iconic and just unbelievable It was called the Boys of Pointe du Hoc, one of his most famous speeches, which is worth taking a look at. On to more prosaic matters. The subject of our No Labels talks this week is more domestic policy. We talked to Allysia Finley from the Wall Street Journal about inflation, about the student loan program. And of course, this is part of just a broader series we have underway here at No Labels to get people educated on the issues that are really going to matter in this election in advance of the first debate, which is coming up on June 27th.
Absolutely. I mean, again, another kind of depressing topic to see the direction that the nation is headed in terms of, the financial giveaways, really, and what it's doing to our collective future by, putting us so deep in debt. Our children won't see the end of it if things continue on this way. But again, in the context of D-Day, leadership matters, and leadership, even from a few people, can make such a profound difference, and even right the course of the juggernaut of the debt and deficit.
It can. Leadership and a little bit of luck. Like
yes, exactly.
Good weather.
Exactly.
1944. Well, look, with that, let's get into this talk with Allysia Finley, who's on the ed board, the Wall Street Journal. She's going to talk to us about student debt, inflation, and some other things she'd like to ask of Biden and Trump when they gather on 27th.
Great. Thanks, Ryan.
Hey there, this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here for our next edition of No Labels Talks. And with us today, we have Allysia Finley, from ed board member from the Wall Street Journal. Allysia, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, anytime.
So Allysia writes about a lot of different things for the Journal. She's been focusing a lot on the student loan issue of late, and I'll get right to it. You didn't pull your punches in writing about this. You said, there has never been a taxpayer scam quite like the federal student loan forgiveness program. So why don't we start there? Maybe talking about the outlines of what this program is and why you find it so objectionable.
Okay, well, the taxpayer scam keeps growing, and that's part of the problem. But the federal government lends directly to both undergrads and graduate students. Undergrad loans are actually capped, and the cap is different for those who are dependents and a little higher for those who are independent. That means that they're not considered, their parents don't take them or use them as exemptions on their tax returns. But the grad student loans are actually uncapped, and that's actually becoming the bigger scam now. And actually, if you look at the data, the federal government lent as much to graduate students as it did undergraduates last year. So part of the issue is that the government is lending this money to kids. It doesn't actually provide disclosures about like what are they going to be required to pay after they graduate. They kind of count on colleges to do that. And by the way, they only even require that the students use the money for their tuition and fees. A lot of kids actually, and I've heard this from some colleges, a lot of the kids, at least go to community colleges or such, take out loans to help pay for living expenses, because it's actually the interest rates on the student loans are much lower than they could be if they got a personal loan, for example. So what's happened, especially over the last decade or so, is that the student loan portfolio or balance has exploded. Now it's about 1.6 trillion, over double again that it was about a decade ago. And part of the reason is these income-based repayment plans that were instituted as part of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. Right. Now, these plans were intended to make actually college more affordable and make loan payments more affordable for kids. After they graduated, they capped their loan payments at 10% of discretionary income, which was defined as about 150% of the poverty line. And so it didn't really matter how much you made, you never had to pay more than 10% of basically a nominal amount of your income. What happened is that their monthly payments actually didn't even cover their accrued interest. So it kept on accruing interest. And by the education department's report, at least this year, about 25 million borrowers owe more than they originally took out borrowed. And that's because interest has continued to accrue because these minimum payments haven't covered what they actually owe. And as a result, I mean, that's partly why we have a $1.6 trillion balance, in addition to now these colleges, because the student loans are capped for undergrads, they've started developing more and more graduate programs, master's degrees mainly.
Right.
More have also gotten into the business programs, MBAs, law degrees. You've seen colleges that did, I can say UCI developed a law school, I think a decade or so ago. We never had one before because there's money to be had here. There's more money because the loans aren't capped. And so about 40% of student loans or student loan balance sheet is actually held by people who owe more than $100,000. And that's almost entirely graduate students. And so hence, as I said,
I think a point of confusion for people is, of course, the Supreme Court rejected one of the administration's student debt relief proposals last year. And yet every couple of weeks, it seems like there is a new tranche of forgiveness. So like under what authority is that happening?
So they're using various authorities. I think they've said they've made $160 billion in discrete loan cancellations. One is this public service loan forgiveness plan, and that's again similar to this income-based repayment plan I mentioned before, but loans are forgiven after 10 years of payments. And actually, they count the 3 years of forbearance during COVID when they weren't making any payments as part of those 10 years. So a lot of that is the public service loan forgiveness program. I think I calculated it's about $70,000 per borrower that has been forgiven under that program, which again, that's huge. Some of them have been forgiven under its new SAVE program, which was just instituted, and that actually reduces or sweetens the income-based repayment plans to 5%. You only have to pay 5% of your discretionary income. And so they've started forgiving loans under that program. And then there's these closed school and borrower defense rules. So if you claim your school defrauded you, provided you false information, you can get your loans forgiven under that. And that's mainly been for-profit schools that they've forgiven. But right. I would be surprised if they start doing that for some nonprofits too.
So here's a question though, and you yourself said this. So on the one way to look at this is a huge number. I think in one of your previous columns, you estimated that the all-in cost of all this relief was something on the order of $850 million. On the other hand, it's a real problem for a lot of people. You just said 25 million people, their interest payments were outstripping their principal. So the question is, it is a real problem for a lot of people. And once you get to that point where interest payments are outstripping your principal payments, you might be in a hole you can't get out of. Do you think there's another way that we could be dealing with this, that, you know, providing a pathway for relief for people, maybe in a way that's either more affordable, or maybe at least it fixes some of the underlying problems in the system so this doesn't keep repeating over time?
Well, I think one issue or one way to deal with it is to put colleges actually on the hook for some of these loans that end up getting forgiven or aren't repaid, to hold them accountable for some of these degree programs and to ensure that their grads actually are able to get quote unquote gainful employment. Now they're actually doing that for-profit schools, vocational schools, and that it's quote unquote gainful employment rule, but there are no such rules for nonprofits or public colleges. And honestly, I don't think that there's really a difference. I think they all kind of operate in a for-profit mode. It's just how they distribute their profits. For-profit colleges distribute them to shareholders, and the way that nonprofits and public colleges do is that they basically distribute the earnings to faculty, tenured professors, or administrative. They spend their money a little differently. So I think that's one way. I would consider, again, reducing or capping the graduate program loans. I think that's really low-hanging fruit, and that's where a lot of the students actually are getting in over their heads. And increasingly, I think I saw somewhere almost like half of students now graduating end up going to earn advanced degrees after that. And part of this problem is they don't really know what they want to do. They get out of college and they're like, oh, well, I don't really want to know what I want to do, so I'm going to go back to school and, you know, earn another degree. And then they pile up $50,000-$60,000 more in debt. And this is where like they just aren't able to repay them on the salaries that they earn after graduating. So I would think that the one easy way is to cap graduate student loans. And if you actually, banks actually would like to get into this business and actually want to have pitched Congress on just actually eliminating the graduate student program, graduate lending program, and making it more like banks would lend to students based on, you know, their ability to repay. If they're in, you know, a business program or law program or med school program, then they might have lower interest rates. So they would actually adjust the interest rates or adjust the loans based actually on the risk of the loans. I think that makes more sense for a graduate program than for an undergrad.
Yeah. Well, look, this feeds into, and you've written about this, what is going to be besides immigration, really the defining issue of this election, which is inflation. It's going to, of course, be a huge subject of discussion in the debate we have coming up in 3 weeks. And there are very discrete theories on each side for the cause of this. And so you will hear President Biden, Democrats, say it's greedflation, which is companies padding their profit margins, or shrinkflation. You're making me pay the same for a 10-ounce bag of chips that I used to be able to get a 12-ounce bag of chips. So that's one theory of why. And then the other one is one you've articulated, which is it's just excessive monetary and fiscal stimulus. And so deconstruct that a little bit. Why don't you put a lot of stock in the corporate greed theory of inflation?
Well, if you look at the issue one is that it is a supply and demand issue. And you saw it early in the pandemic. I mean, the president and others blamed supply chains. And that was part of the problem, is that there wasn't a supply and there was an increased demand for a lot of products. And some of that was being fed or caused by the lockdowns. And so you saw an increase in spending on household goods and such because people weren't able to go spend their money at restaurants. And so therefore, early in the pandemic, you saw a big increase in prices and autos and other products, actual physical goods, and not so much in services. And at the same time, you had, I put in my latest article, $5 trillion. I think it's $5 trillion in COVID spending from Congress over those 2 years. I think it's actually probably $6 trillion. The $5 trillion was the official estimate, but that didn't include the extensions of the pandemic emergency, which increased food stamps and Medicaid payments and some other home welfare programs. And so you had all this money pouring into the economy and consumers, and now also actually businesses for that matter. And so you had a lot of money in cash, and the economy was flooded with that. But so there was demand, but there's the supply just wasn't there. And part of that was, by the way, I think, and I think there's been some pretty good evidence suggesting that the enhanced unemployment benefits, the $300 plus up that the federal government gave, was contributed to that because there was a disincentive to work. So all that money has actually continued to flow through the economy. I think by some estimate, more than half of the spending that was given to states still hasn't been spent, and which really is incredible. I think they got more than $350 billion from the March 2021 bill. The San Francisco Federal Reserve estimated that the pandemic, quote unquote, excess savings, so what people saved in excess of what they would normally have because of all these transfer payments, those were just exhausted earlier this year. And then pile that on top of that, you had a lot of refinancing activity for homes. People locked in historically low interest rates. I know in California, people were saving over $1,000 a month by refinancing. And all of that has $1,000 a month, so that's like $12,000 a year, and all of that has helped boost consumption, which in turn is increasing, prices, and that's what we know, Econ 101. And so that has continued to follow through. And again, I think there have been some constraints on the supply side, and I think regulation is one of them, and the uncertainty. But I think it's really just a matter of fiscal monetary policy. I don't think there's really any evidence that companies are, taking advantage of consumers. They're raising their prices because their own prices have been increasing.
Now, what would you say? I mean, the one of the counters to that is, and there's no dispute that corporate profits on an absolute basis are hit a record at the end of 2023, and profit margins are about twice what they were years ago. Is your point that that's not necessarily a driver of inflation?
I think part of that is, no, exactly. I don't think that's a driver. That's a manifestation of inflation. And that's based on, I mean, well, I guess you mentioned the corporate or the margins, and that's partly, initially at least, when you have a lot of inflation, that actually boosts corporate margins until the supply chains, all that catch up. And right now, I think if I looked at the latest profit data, you've actually seen some erosion in corporate profits, except for the financial companies. And most of a lot of by the way, the corporate profit increases has actually been in the tech sector, which is again driving also the stock market boom, which I think there's some evidence to say that's creating also a wealth effect that's boosting spending, further boosting inflation. So there's a lot going on and moving parts here.
So one of the big things we have coming up next year, and again, this is going to get discussed undoubtedly at the debate in a couple of weeks, is the expiration of a lot of the provisions of the Trump tax cuts from 2017. And the CBO was out with an estimate suggesting that the full extension of those cuts would tack on another about $3.5 trillion to the debt. Here's my question to you. There's the potential fiscal impact of the tax cut extension, but then the other thing is the potential inflationary impact, which is, would you have a concern that, for the same reason you have a concern about student loans, or once again just stoking demand and putting more money into the economy, do you think we can afford to extend tax cuts out over the course of the next decade, or are you worried that that would spur inflation?
Well, I think we're looking at, I wouldn't look at quite it that way. Well, for one, my bigger concern with student loans is the moral hazard issue of lending to people and saying you don't have to repay them. Not really the inflation issue there. I think it does contribute to inflation at the margins. Now, on the tax cuts, I think there is some evidence, at least on, when you have a corporate tax cuts, especially, that those have those increased investment and increased productivity actually over the long term boost worker wages and do end up paying for themselves. The tax cuts that don't necessarily end up paying for themselves are actually the ones at the lower ends, and the redistribution is the ones which are the child tax credits. And those are actually the ones that I think you'd see more support, at least on the Democratic side, for extending. And there will probably be some kind of negotiation to extend those, along with the rate cuts, perhaps the top rate. I think there's going to be a lot of resistance on the Democratic side to extend the rate cut, and just to back up, most of the corporate tax cuts were permanent, except for the expensing provision. And some of those are actually more the most expensive, quote unquote, expensive components. But there was a substantial increase in investment as a result of that. And I think you are going to need that investment if you want to continue the economy growing. And we're already seeing signs that's slowing down, and there's been a slowdown in business investment in particular. Consumer spending is really what has been driving the economy. So I would actually look at it this way, that we can't afford not to extend some of these tax cuts.
Well, in your view, what do you think are the most important elements of the tax cut that need to be expended, that people should really go to the mat for? Is it the corporate rate cuts? Is it the faster depreciation? Or is it something?
Well, I think the expensing is, I mean, there are many, the expensing provisions, and those have already started phasing out. I think those would be especially helpful to extend. I think all the rate cuts on the income or the individual side, I think those, just as a matter of practicality, those are going to get extended. Maybe not the top rate, but the top rate is important to extend, because those are the people who are actually the entrepreneurs. A lot of entrepreneurs, small businesses pay on the or as S-Corps pass through and pay onto the individual side. There's also a small business deduction that's also part of the tax reforms, and that's probably also going to be important to extend. I'd make one other point, is that a lot of what the Biden administration is actually not just saying, we don't want to extend these, we actually want to raise some of these taxes on the corporates, and capital gains tax. I think it is proposed actually increasing capital gains tax to around 44% once you include this Medicare surcharge that it wants to impose. And I think that would be extremely disruptive to investment at this point.
Okay. I want to pivot to something else you wrote about recently, which is you cited a famous children's book to talk about what is wrong with our world today, which is you were trying to answer the question, how did our world culture and politics become such a mess? And you said that the answers found in this book about what happens if you give a kid a cookie, and the appetite that spurs, and why once you stimulate that appetite tends to lead for more and a desire for more. Maybe talk about that a little bit, and then how and why that's creating such a problem on college campuses, in your view.
Okay, so I think it's essentially an allegory of the slippery slope. You give someone something, they're going to demand something else, and in order to, once they get that, they're going to demand it because it's effectively appeasement or placating, and you see this in foreign affairs. But you also see this is with young people, and in fact, in my view, is I think kids have been indulged a little too much, starting from when they're young kids, and which is where you get the high school teachers often give them high grades. Because their parents, be quite frank, often demand that, and then they get to college and they have started demanding all kinds of particular accommodations. And these aren't just, I mentioned my story, diversity, equity, inclusion, special dorms, special, extra counselors and such. And colleges have been very accommodative. They've been generous. They've given into a lot of these demands. And then the kids have started demanding more things. And that includes, we've seen the recent protests, they've started camping out on the quads. And they've demanded divestment from Israel, along with some other cutting off all kinds of research, any kind of partnerships with Israeli scientists. There are a whole host of things. And a lot of colleges actually didn't respond to that. They said, okay, like we'll let them, make their statements, and then they just escalated their demands, and then they took over some buildings. I think I saw that some Stanford students just took over the president's office today, and that's what happens is when you keep on giving in, saying, okay, we'll try to meet you halfway. When you're conciliatory on some of these issues, they're just going to keep demanding more things. And again, I think I could go back to this has happened with the student loan program. It wasn't enough that Biden just tried to predict 10,000 that got struck down. You're seeing demands for even more for loan forgiveness.
Allysia, of course, you went to Stanford, and you've talked in the past about how when you were there several years ago, you found the intellectual environment to be kind of stifling and not tolerant of differing views. I mean, do you think it's gotten meaningfully worse since you were there?
I would. I recall being on a panel discussion. Maybe this was my senior year. There was discussion. I was on various panels because they always tried to bring someone who was more conservative. And, it was a respectful, they were usually respectful dialogues. I don't think that they have those these days. I think you're seeing a lot of cancellation, especially of speaker events. And you saw that at the law school, where you got the Fifth Circuit Judge Duncan, who came in, and the law students, I mean, to be quite honest, they acted barbarically. And there are various reasons for that, and you could go back to if you give a mouse a cookie, and that's partly because they haven't really they've been told that, well, it's okay if you shout down speakers and all of that, we won't punish you. But in any case, I think the atmosphere, at least even when I was back, that was 15 years ago, was still more cordial and respectful, and there was more of an intellectual debate on some of these issues. Now I think it's become more intolerant, and that's because maybe probably because of some of the students they enroll, and part of the graduate programs and professors have become a little more radicalized in their hiring. I think there are a lot of things, and I don't think it's unique to Stanford. I think it's pretty pervasive across all of higher education.
Do you think, I mean, look, one of the nuclear options that has been bandied about in Congress as it relates to a lot of the rampant anti-Semitism on college campuses, on the intolerance for dissenting views, you are starting to hear some voices talking about threatening the federal funding that colleges receive if they don't make certain commitments. I read somewhere, somebody said, colleges should have to sign on to something akin to the Chicago Principles, which is what the University of Chicago's foundational free speech principles. Could you see us headed towards a situation like that where the federal funds for colleges are really on the chopping block, or is that probably an empty threat?
I think there is an appetite from both sides to hold these colleges accountable by various means. And you actually saw that I think some Democrats introduced legislation to hold them accountable for legacy preferences. I mean, there's a populist upswell that is targeting higher education for various reasons. The left and the right differ about their grievances. But I do think that that's something that colleges should be concerned about. And it's not just federal student loans. A lot of the money that colleges get, like Harvard and Ivy Leagues, a lot of that comes from federal grant money for their research. And I think that's the biggest leverage that they have is because federal government can attach all kinds of strings or conditions to this grant funds without probably even Congress passing legislation to do that. And I think it's something to consider that, yes, they have to agree to have or ensure a non-discriminatory environment and abide by all federal laws. And I think there are some questions whether the Harvard and other colleges have done that in these recent protests.
I want to come back to a fiscal question as we kind of close out here in our last couple minutes, which is this. We're in a situation now where the federal government is accruing about $1 trillion in debt every 100 days, where our debt as a share of GDP is higher than pretty much any time it's been since World War II. George Will wrote something last year. He said, we are headed towards the most predictable crisis in American history. You can just see this coming a mile away. And yet, if you think about the election this year, and you think about Trump and Biden, both of them have taken off the table. They have said they will not touch Medicare and Social Security under any circumstances, which of course are the biggest drivers of our debt. I'm curious, how would you advise a politician today to talk about or even address the debt in a way that is just not completely politically suicidal? Because that is absolutely the third rail. I mean, there are not even really Paul Ryan Republicans anymore who want to talk about the debt, let alone proposing legislation to do it. With some exceptions, Bill Cassidy had a Social Security reform idea. But how does this issue even begin to get addressed when our two leading candidates don't want to talk about it?
Well, I think there could be a bond market revolt eventually, but I think part of the problem, Nikki Haley tried to discuss it and did bring up entitlement reform and said, well, you need to start, raising the retirement age for people who are now in their 20s and 30s. And what happened was Donald Trump attacked her for that. And I think that's the scare, and that in this election, neither Donald Trump or Biden want to be beaten up, over this issue, and probably ever. And that's always it's a third rail. But I think that the way to talk about it is, well, we need to start considering what do we do for these people who are in their 20s and 30s. There are a lot of really low-hanging fruits, adjusting the inflationary index for the growth in Social Security benefits. For people 20 and 30 who really won't notice or won't know when it comes to retiring 30 or 40 years from now. I think politicians need to be cautious, and I think that Nikki Haley tried to say we're not going to do anything for people who are already retiring or who are close to retiring. But again, I think that eventually, the fiscal deficits and debt is going to become such that the politicians are in Congress and whoever's president at that time, probably maybe 5-6 years from now, are going to have to do something about it. And you'll probably see some kind of negotiation that trades tax increases for benefit cuts, probably more tax increases, maybe a lifting of the Social Security, the cap on the taxable wage cap, in return for some modest cuts in benefits.
Do you think there's a chance that with sufficient leadership we could get ahead of this, or do you think we're not going to get around to trying to deal with this until, as you noted earlier, the bond market throws a tantrum and then they have to do something, or one of the trust funds for Social Security or Medicare starts approaching insolvency? Do you see any prospect that absent a crisis we actually tackle this?
Unfortunately not. It tends to be like in this country, the politicians don't do anything absent a crisis or until they're forced to do that. And you see that just on a small scale with every year, or whenever it comes to lifting the debt ceiling deal or debt ceiling, how it comes down to the wire. There are negotiations to lift it in return for something else. Politicians really can't act until there's a crisis, or don't want to. I'm surprised, actually, to be honest, that there wasn't an immigration deal that was struck earlier this year in Congress. James Langford tried to, and I think our immigration system is actually approaching a breaking point, or the border was. And nonetheless, there were Republicans who stymied and killed that bill. And which just shows that even when you essentially hit a crisis point, there are still going to be political obstructionists who try to prevent any kind of compromise.
Yeah. Allysia, I want to close with this, which is, we talked about the debate earlier, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. And of course, most of what the candidates have talked about this election cycle is not what really matters. It's a lot of talk about revenge and retribution and everything else. But if you were moderating, I'm curious, and you could ask a single question. Either one question to both of them, or a targeted question to one for Trump, one for Biden. What do you think is the most important one you'd like to hear an answer to?
Ooh, if I had to be honest, what do you do if China invades Taiwan? Which I think could happen in this second term, or second Biden term, or second Trump term. And I think that is actually one of the biggest risks the country faces, because we already are fighting essentially two wars. We're providing aid to Ukraine to fight Russia, but we're also, trying to stretch, providing aid to Israel. And I think if China invades Taiwan and tries to exploit the opportunity, our military is going to be stretched. And how do we respond to that? And that's, I think, one of the biggest questions that both candidates need to be prepared to answer.
Yeah, that would be a showstopper. Well, Allysia, thank you so much for joining us and taking a couple of minutes with us this afternoon.
Sure. Thanks so much too.
And thank you everybody for tuning in to listen to No Labels Talks. We'll look forward to seeing you all next week.